As the harsh winter of 1944 settled over the Ardennes, the stage was set for one of the most intense clashes of World War II. In what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Germany launched a surprise offensive, their last desperate bid to halt the advancing Allies. At the forefront of this bold manoeuvre was the elite 1st SS Leibstandarte, Hitler's own personal guard, seasoned and relentless. Facing them was the powerful 3rd Armoured Division of the United States, led by General George S. Patton, a commander known for his fierce determination and lightning-fast tactics. In the frozen forests and battered villages, these forces would collide in a brutal showdown, pushing men and machines to their limits. The tale of Hitler's bodyguard, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, LAH, in the struggle for Bastogne, does not begin until the United States 4th Armoured Division, which was a part of General George Patton's 3rd Army, lifted the siege of Bastogne on December 26, 1944. This is the moment when the battle for Bastogne began. It was no longer possible to ignore the threat that the American Bastogne salient posed to the flank and rear of German Army Group B at that point in time. In fact, Bastogne was beginning to take centre stage in the Battle of the Bulge. Their division was about to engage in some of the most intense and costly fighting of the whole campaign, but it had already endured a great deal of suffering as a result of its unsuccessful attempt to break through in the northern section of the Bulge. By the fact that the number of American casualties during the second half of the Battle of the Bulge, which lasted from December 30th, 1944 to January 12th, 1945, was about 1/3 higher than during the first half of the conflict. At the same time that the Bastogne salient was presenting a problem to Army Group B, the senior commanders of the United States were aware of the fact that they wanted to achieve a bridge between their 4th Armoured Division and the 26th Infantry Division, which was located to its southeast. It was essential to force the Germans away from the Bastogne-Arlon road, which was the primary open route into the Bastogne pocket. This road was located to the east of the Bastogne pocket. It was decided that the Bastogne-Longvilly road would be the ultimate objective, and the 35th Infantry Division was given the order to go into the opening. By the evening of the 29th, it was directly in the way of the eastern prong of the German counterattack, which was meant to include Hitler's bodyguards, and that was supposed to cut off Patton's 3-corps entrance into Bastogne. On December 28, 1944, the LAH was transferred to the 39th Panzer Corps of the 5th Panzer Army, which was commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, Kampfgruppe 1st SS Panzer Division, with its Panzer Regiment, Panzerjäger Battalion, 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Artillery Regiment, Pioneer Company, and Armoured Reconnaissance Platoon, left the Vilsam area at 16:25 hours and moved into the Longvilly area, according to a report issued by the Headquarters Army Group B during that particular evening. By midday on the 29th, the division had joined Army Group Lutrebois, which was a new unified command that encompassed both the 39th Corps and the 47th Corps. However, due to fuel shortages, certain units of the LAH were actually unable to commence their march until that time. In order to accomplish the task of destroying the Bastogne salient, General Heinrich F. von Luttwitz was given the responsibility. The LAH advanced further south on the night of the 29th to the Tarchance-Loutremange region in order to commence its attack. This was done in order to protect the area. Within this hilly and thickly forested region of the Duchy of Luxembourg, there was a road network that was quite limited in magnitude. There was a blanket of snow covering everything, the roads were covered in ice, and the temperature was much below freezing. The 167th Volksgrenadier Division, VGD, and a Kampfgruppe, KG, of Panzerlehr's 901st Regiment, which had a few Mark IV tanks, were supposed to provide assistance to the LAH in its assault on its northern flank. Furthermore, the latter was already present in the sector, despite the fact that it was feeble and worn out. The 167th VGD had major difficulties in obtaining access to the Bastogne sector after detraining on the east bank of the Rhine. This occurred after the VGD arrived from Hungary on December 24th. Although a third of the division's personnel had served on the Russian front in the past, a significant number of them had only recently joined the Luftwaffe. which further exacerbated the problems that the division was experiencing. There were also no heavier weaponry present. A regiment of the 5th Parachute Division, FSD, which was already in the line and delaying the advance of the United States 35th Division, had also been instructed to support the attack on the southern flank of the LAH. Despite the fact that it was similarly exhausted and badly understrength, the FSD regiment was nonetheless responsible for the reinforcement of the offensive. In preparation for the new mission, the WWII division of the LAH, which was commanded by Major General Wilhelm Mohnke, was divided into 2 general troops. As part of the Northern KG, which was commanded by SS Captain Werner Pötschke, there was a pioneer company, 2 weak battalions of Panzer Grenadiers, and every tank that was available at the time. Taking Lutrebois was the objective of this expedition, after which it was to go onto the Bastogne road at Remonfosse. It was planned that the Southern KG, which was commanded by SS Lieutenant Max Hansen, would travel through Villers-le-Bon-Eau and then make use of Losange in order to reach the Bastogne highway. A pioneer company, an SS reconnaissance platoon, and the 1st SS Panzerjäger battalion were all members of this outfit. Additionally, all of the Panzer Grenadiers who had survived were included. Following their arrival at the Bastogne road, both KGs were to continue their journey in a westerly direction in order to establish a connection with the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, PGD, and the Führer Begleit Brigade, FBB, in the territory that was situated between Assenois and Hompré. It was planned that H-hour would begin at 0600 on the 30th. There is a possibility that the infamous SS lieutenant who was tasked with leading the 1st SS Panzer Regiment of the LAH was a backseat driver with KG Pötschke during this operation. This is something that can be disregarded. After his KG was defeated in the northern sector of the Bulge from December 17th to 25th, he was evacuated due to the mental and physical exhaustion that he had experienced. How strong was the armed forces of the LAH at this point? In spite of the fact that there is a scarcity of solid information coming from German sources, it is still possible to arrive at a fairly accurate estimation of the strength of the division. It was clear that the 1st SS Panzer Battalion still had the potential to field a total of 16 Panther tanks and 26 Mach 4 medium tanks with their theoretical capability, in spite of the fact that it is highly unlikely that more than 15 Tiger II tanks remained operational. The 501st SS Heavy Battalion of the Corps were still in possession of 33 Tiger II tanks. The 1st SS Panzerjäger Battalion under Karl Rettlinger had encountered very few casualties and ought to have had approximately 18 Jagdpanzer Pi-4s. There is a lack of clarity regarding the number of tanks and Jagdpanzers that were actually transported to the Bastogne region. It appears highly implausible that more than 50 of the 93 were utilised in combat in that sector. Hansen was left with the remnants of his 1st and 3rd battalions, while Rudolf Sandig's 1st SS Panzer Grenadier battalions and Hansen's 2nd battalions were transferred to KG Pötschke. In terms of infantry, Hansen was left with the remaining personnel. With everything taken into consideration, it is quite probable that each Leibstandarte KG had around 1 battalion of Panzer Grenadiers at their disposal. On the 30th of December, the relevant front line moved southward from Neffe, through the woodlands to the east of Marvy, then down the Lutrebois-Loutremange road and into the woods to Villers-le-Bon-Eau and Livarchamps, and ultimately eastward below Harlange. According to what was stated earlier, the American 35th Infantry Division was located smack dab in the heart of the German offensive. In the early evening of December 29th, the 134th Regiment had taken the majority of Lutrebois. Meanwhile, the 137th Regiment had captured Saint-Lez and Livarchamps from the 5th FSD and had penetrated Villers-le-Bon-Eau with 2 companies on the same night. Both regiments had taken control of Lutrebois. In accordance with the history of the division, it is stated that they were unable to fully dislodge a company of German pioneers and ended up sharing the village with them for the remainder of the night. The 320th, which was the 3rd Regiment of the 35th Division, was engaged in bitter battle with troops of the 5th FSD. This conflict took place in the woods and around a farm, which is located 1,000 meters southeast of Harlange. This position was reached after the division had fought for 3 days and suffered 148 casualties in the course of the conflict. A paucity of ammunition made the artillery fire plan that preceded the LAH attack ineffective and inadequate. This was the case because of the lack of ammunition. On the other hand, the front tanks of KG Poeczka advanced on parallel lines from Lutrebois at 0625 hours. Today's video is sponsored by World of Warships Legends. If you're a fan of intense naval battles and a taste of authentic history, World of Warships is a massive multiplayer console game that brings you into the heart of naval warfare on a grand scale. Whether you're commanding destroyers, battleships, cruisers, or even aircraft carriers, each ship offers a unique experience. In honor of the end of World War I, World of Warships Legends is introducing a selection of iconic World War I warships available at special prices. These vessels are designed with meticulous detail, paying tribute to their real-life legacies. Some standout ships include the Oklahoma Texas, 1944, and the British Warspite, 1941. Plus, for those who complete the special mission with German or British ships, there's an exclusive chance to earn the Von der Tann, Germany's pride from the Battle of Jutland. If you're new to World of Warships, there's a welcome pack ready for you to dive into the action. Get the American Tier 3 premium battleship Arkansas, the German Tier 3 cruiser Karlsruhe, 7 days of premium account, and camouflages to give you a strong start. Unlike many fast-paced shooters, World of Warships rewards strategic thinking and precise decision making. The game's slower pace means every move counts, and each match gives you time to think, plan, and strike with precision. The game is more simple than you think, with PvP battles ranging from 9 vs 9 to unique 3 vs 3 vs 3 vs 3 matchups. Each game is dynamic and offers fresh challenges. With over 400 ships from 11 nations, there's always a new vessel to master. Every 5 weeks, new missions and ships are added to the game, keeping the experience fresh and exciting. If you're ready to command legendary warships and experience naval warfare like never before, check out the link below to download World of Warships Legends on PS and Xbox and start building your fleet. The men under Monka's command were lucky in that the morning of the 30th was cloudy and had poor visibility. On the other hand, this prevented the Luftwaffe from giving the backup that had been promised, and it also prevented the Allied fighter bombers from approaching during the initial few hours of the attack. As Poeczka's tanks moved closer to Lutrebois, the only resistance they faced was artillery fire. Lutrebois was manned by a battalion of the 35th Division, 3 134th, while another battalion of the same division, 2 134th, was stationed in the woodline on the ridge that dominated the valley to its south. Due to the fact that artillery fire slowed the advance, the Panzer Grenadiers were able to easily break through the American defences south of Lutrebois. The village was ringed by a number of tanks, 7 of which could be seen turning around to the north. According to reports, 2 of them were destroyed by artillery fire, while 4 of them were claimed by American tank destroyers. One of them was found to be stopped on a mine. At 0635 hours, the headquarters of the 4th Armoured Division, which is known as Combat Command ACCA, got information of the German onslaught. The location of this battle command was just east of the Bastogne road and behind the northern unit of the 35th Division. Its most advanced components were virtually pointing north when they were located at Relentless. After commanding his troops to turn east and reinforce the 35th Infantry Division, the American commander did not waste any time in doing so. The CCA's report following the incident states, "Our position was seriously threatened by an enemy infantry infiltration through the woods to within 400 yards of the highway, Bastogne Road, and a counterattack of at least infantry battalion strength backed by SP guns and 20 to 30 tanks that drove 314 out of Lutrebois." As the northern regiment of the 35th Division was forced to flee south through the woods into Los Angeles, the Mark Ives belonging to Poeczka's 6th SS Panzer Company were approaching Point 535. From this vantage point, they had a view of Remonfoss and around 3 to 4 kilometers of the Bastogne Road, at the same time that the 7th Panzer Company was making its way towards Siwet. The situation that CCA was in was actually getting worse. As soon as possible, action needs to be taken. Additionally, an armoured infantry battalion and 2 tank companies, the 51st Armoured Infantry Battalion and the B&D 35th Tank Battalion, were dispatched by the United States of America to the woodlands located to the west of Lutrebois in order to provide support. Also, they utilised every single piece of artillery and ground assault plane that was at their disposal. As the day progressed, the weather appeared to be getting better, and the LAH tank companies were now out in the open, putting them in a precarious position. According to the information provided by CCA, B Company, strength 6 tanks, engaged 13 enemy tanks that were moving northwest out of Lutrebois at approximately 1100 hours, destroying 11 of them without suffering any casualties. Both the artillery and the air were able to provide significant help, with the artillery being able to break up various troop concentrations and the air being able to achieve 7 verified tank kills. The weather was clear and visibility was strong. The official history of the United States Army, written by Hugh M. Cole, contains additional information regarding the air assistance for the operation. The main body of the 1st SS Panzer KG came from the Lutrebois route approximately 1 hour before noon. A total of approximately 25 tanks were observed during this movement. There were 7 tanks that were destroyed or severely damaged, and the majority of the panzers were driven back, despite the fact that it took 2 hours to get the fighter bombers into the combat. For this particular action, the following additional information may be obtained in the AAR of the CCA Tank Battalion. While flying in a Cub plane, an artillery spotter from the 4th Army Division noticed 13 German tanks as they approached the forest southeast of Lutrebois. He then sent this information to Company B of the 35th Tank. A platoon from the 701st Tank Division and 6 Sherman tanks were waiting in an ambush close to a small ridge that gave Hull defilade. During the brief period in which the fog lifted, the leading German company, or platoon, which was comprised of 6 panzers, happened to spy Company A of the 35th and turned toward them, therefore exposing their flanks. By the time the first shot was fired, the tank belonging to the German commander had been destroyed, and the remaining tanks continued to move around until they were all destroyed. Each of the 6 other German tanks that made an appearance was either destroyed or rendered useless. None of them survived. While this was going on, the American TDs dispersed the grenadiers that were nearby and took possession of 3 of the assault rifles that were accompanying them. In spite of the fact that these reports assert that a great number of additional tanks were destroyed, they are a very good fit for the limited German accounts of the events that occurred on the 30th. An individual who was a part of the 7th SS Panzer Company named Manfred Thorn recalled, "We arrived in the Lutrebois hills at approximately 0930. Infantry from the United States was dispersed across the left side of the woodland which was located along the road. There was only 100 meters of forest that bordered the road before the first Lutrebois dwellings were spotted. At the bottom of the forest on the right side there was a panther standing. After disappearing behind a ridge on the horizon to the west, the remaining panzers belonging to the 6th Company vanished. On their journey, they were heading in the direction of Remonfosse. After that, the company drove in a broad wedge shape into the hills beginning 4 kilometers to the south of Bastogne, which is located to the north of Remonfosse. Our right was occupied by the woods, and our left was occupied by the open space. Lutrebois was located behind us. At 15:15, we noticed that other panzers which were located behind us had already been struck and were on fire. Within a span of 10 minutes, 6 of our company's tanks were lost to destruction. We will never know for certain whether the Panther in question belonged to Werner Pötschke. Nevertheless, it is certain that his command Panther was rendered inoperable. Later on that day, he and his adjutant, Rolf Reiser, were taken back to their command post in a 7th Company Mark IV. Thorn's Mark IV made its way back into the forest after the last light appeared, and it eventually made its way to Brass. A further member of the 7th Company, Rolf Erhardt, provided an explanation of his role. After leaving the town centre, Lutrebois, on our left, we kept heading in a northwesterly direction, thereby completely avoiding it. Unpredictably, we were aware of activities in the vicinity of the 6th Company. As the panzers leaned to the left, one of them fired its primary armament toward the enemy. The artillery barrage has become more intense. After that, the explosions took on a new tone, a whip crack that was drier and more intense. It was the prominent wooded ridge that encompasses almost 3 kilometers along the west side of the Bastogne-Ardennes road that was the origin of the fire, which was coming from the direction of the west. There is a good chance that anti-tank guns were placed further to the left of the 6th Company by the Amies. There were 2 shells that were exploding in front of our tank. Immediately in front of us, a tank was destroyed. It was almost a comfort when we were struck ourselves when we were struck. When I finally got through the fog, I saw that my hatch had disappeared. I was so focused on my own thoughts that I failed to realise that the hit had quickly taken our cannon from the turret. After some time had passed, a separate member of the same unit related how he and his tank commander had gone out that night to search for tanks that had been damaged. They found 6 in a row, all of which were from their own company and were still blazing when they found them in an open field. Even though SS Captain Oscar Klingelhofer had been burned, he would soon return to head what was left of the company. It was remarkable that just 2 crewmen had been slain during the day at that point. In spite of the fact that the route was horrible and meandered through forests as well as up and down steep valleys, KG Hansen's offensive was successful in making significant progress in the southern portion of the LAH's front. The few German pioneers who had shared Villers-le-Bon-Eau with the Americans the night before had been relieved by SS Captain Haft's Panzergrenadiers by the middle of the morning, with assistance from at least 7 Jagdpanzers. Companies K and L of the 3 137th Infantry came under attack by 7 tanks Jagdpanzers heavily supported by infantry, was the explanation provided by the AAR of the 35th Division. During the approach of the panzers, the settlement was set ablaze, resulting in the destruction of the stone dwellings. At 8:45 minutes past the hour, the command post of the 137th Infantry received a radio message that requested that the artillery construct a barrage of smoke and heavy explosives. Unfortunately, the radio was destroyed before the gunners were able to identify it. There was only 1 male in the community who was able to escape out of the total of 169 males. The following is an excerpt from the report of the United States Infantry unit that was part in the conflict. The 3rd Battalion occupied 4 buildings in Villers-le-Bon-Eau at 0645, and by 0900 the town's resistance and enemy activity had significantly increased. Both SS forces and enemy assault guns, also known as Jagdpanzers, entered the town in the morning to provide support for the enemy garrison, which consisted of pioneers. Additionally, armoured guns moved across the town and fired at the residences of members of the 3rd Battalion. 2 of the remaining guns were knocked out by bazooka fire, therefore the remaining guns retreated out of the range of the bazooka and began firing direct fire at the residences. The remainder of the battalion was separated from companies K and L to form a separate unit. The German advance continued until 1445 hours, and by 1600 hours they had successfully captured the Chateau Losange position. The primary sections of Hansen's KG, however, came under severe artillery fire and direct tank and anti-tank fire from the 137th Infantry Regiment and parts of the CCA as they arrived to the main Bastogne road, which was located immediately west of the chateau. This would prove to be the most significant moment in Hansen's advance. When the assault came to a halt, Hansen gave the command for his soldiers to maintain their stance. The 35th Division had been pushed back to a line that spanned from Remonfosse to Saint-Lay to Livarchamps by the time the 30th of December came to a close. Meanwhile, the Leibstandarte controlled .535, Lutrebois, the Chateau Losange region, and Villers-le-Bon-Eau. However, the German assault had been unsuccessful in reaching the Assenois region and had failed to cross the Bastogne-Arlon highway. Additionally, the cost of the assault had been tremendous. There were at least 20 tanks and Jagdpanzers that were destroyed, and a great number of Panzergrenadiers were either killed or injured. On the other hand, according to the official history, it had achieved an important secondary effect, becoming, as it did, a true spoiling attack that put the 35th Division out of the running from the 31st of December onward. A wedge that was 3 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep had been thrust into the flank of the Bastogne corridor as a result of the offensive itself. In the beginning, the concurrent assault that was carried out by the 167th VGD along the road axis that connected Bras and Bastogne was successful and was able to reach the first homes in Bastogne. The day, however, came to an end for the division around the western border of Marvy as a result of intense artillery bombardment, fighter-bomber strikes, and a counterattack by armoured forces of the CCA. Although it was unable to take part in the larger German assault on the Bastogne corridor because to its lack of strength, the 5th FSD was able to hold its own against the limited strikes that were carried out by the 35th Division on the 30th. When it comes to the battle that took place on the eastern side of the Bastogne corridor on December 31st, neither the German nor the American versions are particularly detailed accounts. In spite of the fact that the weather was clear, there was a significant amount of aviation activity. the Germans reported that 3,550 Allied aircraft were in operation, while only 550 of their own aircraft were in service. According to Ralph Tiemann's History of the LAH, the combat continued with undiminished ferocity on the 31st of the month. Around noon, both of the LAH-KGs made their way back to the Bastogne-Ardennes road. However, they were forced to return to their starting positions as a result of massive artillery fire and counterattacks during the afternoon by the 4th Armoured and 35th Infantry Divisions. All of the after-action reports from the United States divisions do not include any mention of this. The CCA of the 4th Armoured merely asserts that positions that were taken up late on December 30th were fortified and enhanced for the better. The hostile tank that had been hidden at the edge of the forest was taken out of commission. According to the after-action report of the 35th Division, the division was ordered to attack to the northeast, supported by tanks from the 4th Armoured Division, in order to capture the two hills that are 510 metres high northeast of Lutrebois. However, no progress was made. It is possible to find the following entry for the 31st in the war diary of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who was the Commander-in-Chief of German troops in the Western Theatre of Operations. A report from Army Group B at 12:15 hours again described the ferocity of the fighting around Bastogne. Unless the Eastern Group, which consists of the 167th VGD and the LAH, provides aid, the Western Offensive Group, which consists of the 3rd PGD and the FBB, is unable to make any further advancements. Despite the fact that the Eastern Group has recently resumed their assault, they are only able to make a limited amount of headway. The deployment of guns will be temporarily halted for a short period of time. However, it would appear that the forces that have been utilised up to this point are not sufficient to achieve the objective that has been set. Between the 1st and 2nd of January in 1945, there was not a lot of action on the Leibstandarte front. In spite of the fact that the Americans asserted that they had forced Hansen's soldiers out of Losange and the woods west of Villers-le-Bon-Eau, KG Poetzke continued to maintain control of the region around Point 535 and Lutrebois. Field Marshal Walter Model, who was in charge of Army Group B at the time, was of the opinion that a direct assault on the town was more likely to be successful than cutting the Bastogne corridor, which had a very low to non-existent probability of being successful. The decision was taken to deploy the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, which is the sister division of the LAH, in the Bastogne sector after the results demonstrated that they were not satisfactory. As a result of the subsequent battle, the division would suffer catastrophic casualties in terms of troops, including the loss of 7 Mark IV tanks, 6 Panthers, 17 Jagdpanzer IVs, 7 Jagdpanzer Vs, and 18 armoured personnel carriers. On January 4th, KG Poetzke launched a local counterattack with armour in an effort to recover Lutrebois. This was done after elements of the 35th Infantry Division were successful in infiltrating the village on January 3rd. Despite the fact that the offensive was initially effective, it ultimately failed, and by the time the sun set, the Americans had placed the German tanks back in Lutrebois. Although this was the case, German control was maintained over the wooded areas to the east and south of Lutrebois. Despite the fact that they had lost the road intersection that was directly to the northwest of the village, Hansen's men continued to maintain a solid control over Villers-le-Bon-Eau. The after-action report of the 35th Division recounts German counterattacks by both infantry and tanks. These counterattacks occurred further east, after the 137th Infantry had taken 4 houses in the village of Harlange. The KG of Hansen most probably assisted the 5th FSD in fending off American advances there as well, and it is most possible that the tanks that were said to be present were Jagdpanzers. The American reports for January 5th to 6th only detail heavy opposition to all of their attempts to advance on the LAH, including the following narrative of events in the history of the Leibstandarte, which is not covered in the reports. On January 5th and 6th, the attack against the Bastogne-Ardennes road was continued in the 167th VGD and LAH sectors. Heavy blocking fire from the 4th and 6th Armoured Divisions as well as the 35th Infantry caused the 1st Regiment's 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Battalion and the remaining assault guns from Villers-le-Bon-Eau to halt their advance toward Losange from the very beginning. The regiment only had 80 soldiers at its disposal. The 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Battalion launched an assault from the forest to the west of Tachon in order to regain Lutrebois. The assault was supported by around 100 troops, the remaining personnel of the 6th SS Panzer Company, and various battle units from the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, all of whom were armed with panthers. The assault reached the positions of the adversary on the outskirts of the town. It was driven away by the overwhelming anti-tank firepower and the coordinated use of all infantry weapons that were present there. Despite the fact that the Leibstandarte remained to maintain their positions until January 7th, the situation in Germany was becoming so alarming that it was quite likely that another catastrophe similar to the one that occurred in the Falaise pocket would occur. The following day, Hitler granted Field Marshal Model permission to cede the territory that was located to the south of Bastogne and to the west of Houffalize. On the 10th, the LAH was intended to pull out of the competition. On January 9th, Patton's Third Corps launched a coordinated offensive that resulted in the destruction of the little Bulge that was located southeast of Bastogne. Following the action, the 35th Division has provided a concise report. After receiving the command, the division was instructed to resume their assault in the northeastern region. At the same time that the 320th Infantry marched 800 metres, the 6th Armoured Division supplied backup. There was a 1-kilometre advance made by the 134th Infantry. According to the history of the LAH, the American forces launched an assault on the positions held by the 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Battalion on the western border of Villers-la-Bonne-Eau. The assault came from the direction of Losange and Livarchamps, and it was followed by continuous artillery bombardment and robust tank support. During the course of the evening, there was one attempt to break into the midst of the village centre. Armed with assault guns, the leading members of the SS and the battalion were able to prevent it from happening. In preparation for a counterattack, the unit carried out preparations during the night. On other front lines, there have been no reports of activities of this nature. Beginning on January 10th, the 167th VGD and the 5th FSD began to return to the Baiserie-Warden-Bras line. In addition, the LAH began its withdrawal early that morning to a site east of St. Vith, where it was scheduled to return to the command of the ISS Panzer Corps headquarters. One piece of consolation for the United States 35th Division, which had already sustained 1,432 casualties in combat by that moment, was the fact that it had caused significant damage to its primary adversary. A member of Hansen's 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier provided the following explanation regarding a portion of the evacuation. "We were ordered to evacuate the Lutrebois-Villers-la-Bonne-Eau corridor and gather to the east early on January 10th. It was practically light when we arrived at the hills on the road to Harlange, Tachon, which is where we were going. Once again, we were gravely injured as a result of being subjected to fire from American tanks that were located there, near the border with the Duchy of Luxembourg. Our arrival in Doncalz, which is located to the east of Bastogne, took place in the afternoon. On January 10th, the 137th Infantry pushed forward against the enemy, making a slight gain and capturing the much sought and fought for town of Villers-la-Bonne-Eau, a target of the regiment for the past 13 days. The United States regiment that was tasked with capturing the same area said, describing the events that took place. Both tanks and TDs were of assistance to the regiment. At 9:15, the regiment began their assault, and by 1400 they had 2 buildings on the outside of the town that had been completely destroyed. Later on in the afternoon, the entire community was eliminated from the area. During the hour of 1400, the column was subjected to an airstrike and artillery bombardment, and hostile vehicles obstructed the route leading from Lutrebois. A high number of casualties were incurred by the regiment today. The fact that Villers-la-Bonne-Eau had almost completely disappeared by the 10th of January is not surprising at all, considering that the village had only 15 homes before it was completely obliterated by the war. The Americans claimed that during the course of a single day of action, it was struck by an estimated 6,000 rounds of artillery fire. In spite of the fact that minor armoured elements of the LAH carried out a few costly but insignificant encounters over the course of the subsequent 4 days in order to cover their withdrawal, the LAH's participation in Hitler's final major campaign in the West was not nearly as substantial as it had been in the past. In comparison to what this division had become, the division that had entered action on December 16th after 3 weeks of intensive warfare was nothing more than a shadow of what this division had become. In spite of the fact that there is no evidence accessible concerning the size of the Panzer Grenadier battalions. It is quite possible that they were comprised of a number of soldiers that were rather greater than a few hundred troops. On January 15, 1945, official strength estimates for the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion of the Corps of Engineers and the LAH revealed some surprises with regard to armour. These figures were made known to the General Staff. 333 Tiger IIs, 19 Macafees, 12 Panthers, 11 Jagdpanzer Vs, 4 Sturmgeschütz Stu-G assault guns, 62 tanks and 15 Jagdpanzers or assault guns that were still in service are shown here. Additionally, there are 4 Sturmgeschütz Stu-G assault guns. In addition to this, 13 Tigers, 3 Macafees, 1 Panther and 2 Stu-Gs were undergoing maintenance and repairs at the same time. For the purpose of making a credible evaluation of the losses that were sustained during the fighting in the Bastogne zone, the following data can be utilised. 7 Mark IVs, 4 Panthers, 7 Jagdpanzers and 2 Tigers were among the losses. After the combat was over, personnel of the United States Army took images of the 2 Tigers and 2 Panthers. These photographs were taken immediately after the conflict. There is evidence from a number of sources that one of the Tigers was found in the Ardennes region, while the other Tiger was found in close vicinity to Villers-le-Bon-Eau, despite the fact that viewers might be surprised to learn that the armour losses mentioned above are significantly lower than what the Americans claimed. It is essential to understand that the topography in the Lutrebois region made it impossible to deploy a significant number of armoured vehicles. This is something that should be taken into consideration. Furthermore, according to the official history of the United States Army, 2 or 3 units would claim to have destroyed what on later examination proves to be the same enemy tank detachment, and a cumulative listing of these claims, roughly 50 German tanks destroyed, probably gives more panzers put out of action than 1st SS Panzer brought into the field. It is also a little unusual that neither side brought up the fact that Tigers were involved in the Lutrebois-Loutremange issue. This is something that should have been brought up. It would appear that the fact that a photograph was taken of a person who was supposedly knocked unconscious on January 8th in the 1st United States Army sector is evidence that a relatively small number of persons were able to navigate their way to that zone. On the other hand, a tank company from the United States has reported that on January 4th in the late afternoon, 2 Tigers were responsible for the destruction of 4 of its tanks in the Madurai region. This information was provided by the company. The following item can be found in the summary of activities that the battalion, of which the company was a part, had for the month of January 1945. 2 Tiger tanks were destroyed. This item details the events that occurred on January 5th. Between the dates of December 28th and January 10th, it was reported that a KG consisting of 14 to 16 Tigers from the 501st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion had been operating in the general neighbourhood to the east of Bastogne. In general, these sources provide credence to the assertions that this KG was the one responsible for the activities. It is not possible to obtain any information that can be considered reliable regarding the actions of this KG. Because of this, Hitler's bodyguard was no longer able to take part in the war that took place in the Ardennes in Belgium, that the division had been denied the air support that was required for this kind of operation, that they had been forced to fight over terrain that was not suitable, and that they had been deprived of crucial supplies is the conclusion that can be drawn from this. However, it is also essential to consider that the soldiers of the LAH had repeatedly been taken aback by the circumstances in which they found themselves, and by the quickness with which the Americans responded to their attacks. This is something that should be taken into consideration. This was a direct consequence of the shortcomings that were present in the intelligence services of the German government.
A tank commander participated in the heavy fighting near Bastogne. His account gives insight into the chaos and desperation during the final days of the offensive. The American artillery pounded us day and night, and they were well prepared. Our tanks were struggling through deep snow. It was so cold that our engines froze. I remember the sound of American planes roaring overhead. They had found a break in the clouds and bombarded us. My men were exhausted, running on barely any food or fuel. I felt the cold seeping into my bones, and every day was a struggle to even stay awake. There was no question of retreat. We had orders to push forward, and we tried, but it was hopeless. A soldier from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division shared his experience years later in a post-war interview. "We were young, many of us barely trained. They threw us into this freezing forest, and every night we wondered if we would see the morning. The cold was unrelenting, but the Americans were worse. They defended each village, each road with everything they had. The battle went on day after day, and the losses mounted. I remember seeing our wounded, lying in the snow, and there was nothing we could do for them. Supplies stopped coming, we couldn't even bury our dead. The Americans fought with a fierceness that shocked us. They would not give in, no matter how hard we tried to push through." Wilhelm, an infantryman in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, recalled his experience fighting near Bastogne in a letter he wrote after the war. "They called it a bold plan, but it was suicide. Bastogne was surrounded, but every time we moved closer, the Americans seemed to grow stronger. We were exhausted, with barely any food, and freezing in our thin uniforms. I watched my comrades fall around me, some from bullets, others from the bitter cold. I remember one day seeing the American planes dropping supplies over the town. It felt like a bad joke. They had everything they needed while we were scraping the bottoms of our ammunition boxes. Our commanders told us we'd break through, that we'd push the Americans out, but every attempt ended in failure. The worst part was the silence in the forest after each failed attack, the quiet where you could almost hear the snow falling. Eventually, our unit was ordered to pull back. We left Bastogne behind us, a bitter defeat that marked the end of any hope we had for a German victory. That day, as I looked back at the town, I knew that the war was lost." Hans Schmidt served in the 5th Parachute Division, one of the divisions tasked with taking Bastogne. Years later, he recalled the hardships of the offensive. "We were told that Bastogne was the key. If we could capture it, we would cut the Americans off and turn the tide of the battle. But every attempt to move closer was met with American machine guns and artillery. We advanced through snow up to our knees, each step becoming more difficult as frostbite set in. On Christmas Eve, we received an order to prepare for another assault. It was supposed to be our final push. I could barely feel my hands as I loaded my rifle. They were swollen and cracked from the cold. Our officers tried to keep morale up, but we were starving, exhausted, and half frozen. I remember looking at the men next to me, their faces gaunt and pale, some with blackened fingers from frostbite. We charged toward the American positions, only to be met by a barrage of fire. The trees around us splintered from the impact of artillery, showering us with deadly wooden fragments. I lost count of how many times we threw ourselves to the ground, only to get up and advance a few more meters. Many of us fell that day, and those who survived were forced to crawl back to our lines in the snow, leaving behind our wounded." Corporal Walter Ernst was a member of a Panzer Grenadier unit that attempted to break the American defences around Bastogne. In a letter he wrote after the war, he recounted the battle's toll on him and his comrades. "We were up against the 101st Airborne, and they defended Bastogne as if their lives depended on it. Every attack we made was thrown back with brutal force. Their artillery was unrelenting, and it was clear they were well prepared and supplied. I remember one attack where our tank column tried to push through, but as we approached their lines, a single American anti-tank gun opened up on us. One after another our tanks were hit. We, the infantry, were forced to move forward under fire. The snow was red with blood, and we couldn't retrieve the wounded. I will never forget the cries of those left behind in the frozen forest, pleading for help that would never come. Some of us were simply too numb to feel anything anymore. We were starving, barely able to move, and each day brought news of more casualties." Otto Kretschmer served as a medic in the German army during the Ardennes Offensive. His account provides insight into the horror of battlefield medicine during the siege of Bastogne. "Our wounded filled every shelter and bunker we could find. The cold was merciless, and there were times I thought it would kill more of us than the enemy bullets. I worked day and night, trying to treat frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and infections with hardly any supplies. The American artillery never ceased, and each explosion meant more wounded, more desperate faces looking up at me in the hope that I could do something. We ran out of painkillers early on, and I had to resort to using strips of cloth as makeshift bandages. I will never forget the look in their eyes. Young men barely out of boyhood, freezing and in agony, clinging to any hope they could find. Many of them simply gave up, lying silently in the snow, waiting for death as the cold overtook them. We knew the Americans were well supplied, and it felt like we were the forgotten ones. Every day more of our men disappeared, either frozen in the snow or taken by the wounds we could no longer treat. It was a nightmare. Bastogne was more than just a battle. It was a graveyard where we were slowly, methodically buried by a force we could no longer withstand. Hans Huber was an artilleryman in the Wehrmacht and saw firsthand the challenges of providing fire support for the German infantry around Bastogne. Our guns were positioned in the forest, and we fired on the American lines almost constantly. The sound of artillery echoed through the trees, but the cold made everything harder. Our equipment froze up, shells became brittle, and many of our artillery pieces had to be abandoned because we couldn't keep them operational. It felt like we were fighting two enemies, the Americans and the winter itself. One day I remember hearing about a breakthrough attempt. We were ordered to lay down a heavy barrage to soften up the American positions, but it was almost impossible to keep the ammunition coming. The supply lines were so stretched that many of us didn't receive rations for days. There was no warmth, no respite, just snow, ice, and the distant thud of artillery. The Americans returned fire with precision. They seemed to know exactly where we were, and their response was brutal. Each time we fired, we knew they would find us, and many of my comrades were killed from counter-battery fire. Wilhelm Engel served in the 12th SS Panzer Division and recalled the sheer determination of the American defenders. Bastogne was a fortress. We thought they would break under the pressure, but they held. The Americans fought with a stubbornness that surprised us. We tried everything: assaults, flanking, artillery barrages. Every time we advanced, they pushed us back. Their resolve was like nothing I'd seen before. Our commanders grew more desperate as the days dragged on, ordering attack after attack. Each one ended with more of our men lying dead in the snow. One night we pushed forward through the darkness, hoping the cold and the trees would mask our approach. But as soon as we got within range, flares lit up the sky and they opened fire. The snow turned red around us. Some of my comrades were so exhausted they collapsed and couldn't get back up. We left them behind in the snow, knowing they would freeze if the Americans didn't get to them first. The worst part was the silence that followed every failed attack. The forest would grow quiet, and you could hear the cries of the wounded calling for help. Erich Schmidt was a field medic assigned to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and witnessed the toll of the fighting around Bastogne. I remember trying to tend to the wounded as best as I could, but we had so little to work with. We had almost no morphine, and the bandages ran out quickly. It was hellish. The men were freezing, hungry and injured, and there was little I could do to ease their pain. Some of them were so young, barely more than boys, and the cold was brutal. Frostbite was eating away at fingers, toes, even entire feet in some cases. They would look up at me, shivering, eyes glazed, whispering things I couldn't understand. The American artillery was relentless. Every time we heard the whistling sound, we braced ourselves. Often, I would just lie flat in the snow, waiting for it to end, hoping that we would survive one more round. And when the explosion stopped, the forest would be filled with cries and groans. There were not enough of us to help everyone, and many men simply lay there in the snow, slowly succumbing to the cold.
And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.